welcome to all the 320 participants that have joined across time zones and regions. The Zoom is YouTube live as well. So there are many participants who have joined from there. So thank you for joining us for the second session of Writing the Ocean, Ocean as Method. This is part of a Ministry of Education Spark supported project, which is being headed by Professor Nishat Zaidi and Professor Dilip Menon. Professor Nishat Zaidi is the head of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and Professor Dilip Menon is the director of Center for Indian Studies in Africa, University of Witwatersrand. Now, I would like Professor Nishat Zaidi to carry on the conversation and introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Amitav Ghosh.
Thank you, Stephen. I welcome all to the second edition of our webinar series, which we have titled Ocean as Method, Writing the Ocean. As Stephen mentioned, it's a part of our project, which is titled Cosmopolitan Cultures and Oceanic Thought, Thinking Through History Across the Waters. Our project aims to explore alternative modes of expression and knowledge projects, which are anchored in non-human depths of the sea instead of being rooted in the territorial and terrestrial thinking, as Dilip was explaining a while ago. Our guest today is a writer, academic, and anthropologist to whose writings to a great extent we owe this grammar of oceanic imagination and this line of inquiry. I'm indeed delighted to welcome Dr. Amitav Ghosh. I don't know how to introduce him when most of us, I'm sure all of us here, we can recount his works on fingertips, right from his first debut novel, which is The Circle of Reason in 1986, to The Shadow Lines 1988, In an Antique Land 1992, The Calcutta Chromosome 1995, The Glass Palace 2000, The Hungry Tide 2004, The Sea of Poppies 2008, River of Smoke 2011, and Flood of Fire 2015, his recent one 2019 novel Gun Island, which most of us enjoyed reading, and of course we look forward to his next book Jungle Nama. Not only this, most of us have also closely followed the awards that he has won, and the awards that we all very strongly felt he should have won. So thank you so much for taking out time and agreeing to be with us, Dr. Ghosh. I myself have taught your works like The Shadow Lines and Dancing in Cambodia and At Large in Burma at different stages. And in fact, I have been teaching in an antique land, or rather discussing in an antique land with my MA students for more than a decade now. While each year, fresh set of students bring new sets of questions to the classroom, one thing which has remained constant year after year is this feeling of searching for Nabil in airport lounges with a lump in our throats and wondering if we all will vanish into the anonymity of history someday. So I'm so glad that you finally, agreed to this Zoom session, even though you were a little apprehensive about Zoom and online mode. Amitav, it is often said about you that you are a Bengali writer who divides his time between Brooklyn and Goa, but you are basically a Mauritian at heart. Right from your first novel, The Circle of Reason, your writings have engaged with oceanic life, life on board ships, ports, lascars, and so on and so forth. Ocean basically is present in almost all your writings, not only as metaphor or an image, but also as a material site, which generates opportunities of affinities and also anti-colonial, anti-capitalist solidarities. If I may use Edward Glison's phrase, one feels that there is an archipelagic imagination at work in your writings. So how did you turn to ocean, and oceanic imagination? And how has this oceanic imagination helped you recuperate subaltern narratives?
Well, let me say, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Zaidi, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. It's really a great pleasure and a privilege to be participating in this with such an extraordinary audience. So, and thank you also, Professor Zaidi, for a very generous introduction. I must say, I think you've been a little too generous, because the idea of the oceanic imagination and the oceanic method is actually not mine at all. It's Isabel Hofmeier's, as far as I remember, isn't it, Dilip?
Well, both of you.
Yes.
I shouldn't take credit for something that is not mine.
She uses your
Well,
writings to establish that idea.
well, to come to your question, none of this was intentional, really. Um, when I started writing my first novel, The Circle of Reason, I was in Trivandrum, actually, in southern India, and the book is about Indian workers traveling to the Middle East, and and then moving on, actually, to North Africa and so on. And in a way, the book really sort of charted my own travels, because I had spent time in Egypt. And, one of the most exciting things I ever did was to hitchhike across the Sahara on my own. And that, this was way back when such things were possible. I'm talking about 1979. This was while I was learning Arabic in Tunisia. So all those things, all those experiences left a mark on me. But I think one of the experiences that really very profoundly affected my whole life was that as a child, I spent 2 years in Sri Lanka, and I studied there and so on. I was very young. I was like between 9 and 11. But, Sri Lanka, the English that I grew up with in Sri Lanka was very much the transoceanic pidgin, of the Indian Ocean. It had a sort of extraordinary flavor. It's kind of hard to explain it, really. It was a kind of pidgin which was riddled with a lot of obscenities, and it was literally a kind of sailor language, Now, when I go back to Sri Lanka, I don't hear it spoken in that way, not the way that we used to speak it when I was a kid. And I think that profoundly left a mark on me. So when I started writing my Ibis trilogy, for example, I really drew upon my memories of that experience. And in that way, the ways in which pidgin languages have circulated in the Indian Ocean, I think, is really one of the most extraordinary phenomena, really. And, as with all pidgins, a lot of them are sort of re-lexifications of older structures. So I think that's a huge resource, linguistic resource that we had, in this whole Indian Ocean world. And it's something which continues to fascinate me to this day.
Actually, I mean, we'll come back to this question of the multiple registers of language in your work, and we'll probably dwell on it in a little more detail. But just to begin with a slightly personal question, and also a question that's probably weighing on all our minds when we look at the changes that are happening in the world. The first time we managed to spend some time together was in 1984. A few of us had gone up to Oxford on a scholarship. You came to visit, and it was shortly after Indira Gandhi was assassinated. And I remember you're talking about what was happening in Delhi. The pogrom, the smoke rising on the horizon. You've subsequently written about all of this. But for a lot of us who had left India at that time, it was almost as if we had left an India behind, that India had changed beyond recognition. And then you realize as time went on that we are a bit like the angel in Paul Klee's Angel of History, that from 1984 to the present, we've been blown backwards looking at the debris that is accumulating in some sense in India, the debris of secularism and multiple things that we could talk about. Now, what I want to ask you is something that's both personal and political, if you can separate those. How do you relate to this turbulent history of the last 40 years or so in India? And why I ask you this is that, how do we relate to this? Because there's some sense as a writer, a lot of your writings try to escape from the prison house of the nation through summoning up earlier imaginations, the lives of movements of people, which always exceed, the nation in some sense. The other is what attitude should we have towards this? I mean, this is not a prescriptive question, but I just want to see, because there is a way in which you can look with a sense of nostalgia towards the past. The past was always better. We could be cynical, right? And a lot of us have increasingly become cynical that it was always thus, that there's not something nothing particular about the present. But there is in your writings the hope that this churn will move us past these tired paradigms of thinking. So it's actually a question of how you relate to this changes that have been happening in India in particular, how that inflects your writing and thinking about earlier imaginations and vaster spaces. And perhaps you could talk to us about this.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Dilip. Yes, I remember, being at Oxford and all of us speaking in 1984 or 85. It was
84.
after the riots and so on.
Yeah.
Those riots in Delhi were really a kind of, a profoundly formative experience for me. And I think for all of us who had been there, I mean, just to see the sort of horror that unfolded around us. And, I did eventually write about it, but I didn't write about it until 9 years later, because it was really a kind of a deeply traumatizing experience. As I remember, Dilip, did you, after you finished at Oxford, you never worked in India after that, did you?
No, I went back to where you began. I went back to teach in Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. That's where I started in India, yes.
Okay, yes. Well, so this period, 1980, I left in India in 1988 for a couple of years and then returned later in 1990, really. But this period, I realize now when I look back on that time in my life that I was, in a sense, how they talk about PTSD nowadays, post-traumatic stress, that when I came out of Delhi in 1988, I was really traumatized. I mean, I look back on that year and how I responded to it, and I feel, in retrospect, I can only explain it to myself as trauma. And it was a trauma of many kinds. There was the political violence, but there was also the trauma of pollution, in Delhi, even back then. I mean, I remember, that time when I traveled to London in 1984, 85, just your head sort of streaming, with all this muck that would come out, and of course, over the years, it's only gotten worse. So it was really a time of horror, but also a time that was very formative, because in those years, Delhi was intellectually, I would say, an incredibly exciting place. I mean, between the late 70s to the late 80s, Delhi was intellectually so stimulating, such a wonderful place to be. So when I went to Oxford, actually, I loved Oxford. It was socially a lot of fun, but intellectually it was kind of dead, compared to Delhi. I mean, I'd read everything that my teachers wanted me to read, and it was kind of almost funny in that way, But this period of extreme violence and so on really culminated, I think, in 1990-91, in the Babri Masjid. I mean, that was a kind of climactic sort of episode of violence that brought this particular period to an end. But I think we can't forget that after that, between, let's say, 1993 to about 2010, 2011, there was an extraordinary time of exception in India, when we had like almost 20 years of relative peace, an incredible change in people's lives, a sort of a new kind of prosperity for many, though also, of course, of immiseration for many. But the most important thing in those years was that there was communal peace. I mean, not without exceptions, but there was nothing as traumatizing as there was in the 1980s, That, I think, that time is absolutely over now. I mean, it's just gone. And it's not just in India. I feel the same about the United States. I mean, if you look at the 1990s and the 2000 to 2010 period in the US, actually from until 2016, it was again a time of normalcy, if you like. But that normalcy is now gone. I think it's gone everywhere in the world. And for those of us who've been following, climate issues for a long time, we always, I knew when I was writing The Great Derangement that the world is heading towards a great unraveling. How and what form it would take, I didn't know. But that is exactly what we are seeing today. Climate scientists, when they talk about the atmospheres, the atmosphere's sensitivity to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, they're talking about the climate system. But I think the political and social sensitivity to climate change is actually much, much greater than that of atmospheric systems. And for this, we only need to look back on the 17th century and the Little Ice Age. If you look at, just a 1 degree variation in global mean temperatures created such absolute mayhem across the world. In some places, civil wars in England, in Russia, in China, the overthrow of the Ming. Actually, one of the few places in the world that was relatively peaceful in the 17th century was India. Right. And much of the credit for that goes to the Mughals. I wonder why nobody talks about this or writes about this, because the Mughals were actually very sensitive to climate. If you look at even the art of that period, you must have seen this recent book on Mathura. It's on the Little Ice Age and Mathura and so on. So the Mughals created the granaries. They had an intense awareness of climate change, and they created all these sorts of interventions. By distributing.
Sorry, may I interrupt you, Amitav? We'll come back to these questions of climate change and so on and so forth. But one of the things that when you summon up the image of the Mughals, just as much as in your writing, you summon up the idea of geographies, of other geographies, other histories, other movements, and so on. Do you see writing as a form of therapeutic against this gathering storm, or the storm in the middle of which we live? That was really the intent of my question, that the world seems to have changed beyond recognition, but your writing seems to summon up other worlds that existed and worlds that are possible. So something about your practice, is there something about writing as a therapeutic in that sense? That's really was the question that I had in mind.
I don't think writing is at all therapeutic. Okay. Writing is something that is profoundly disturbing. For me, writing has always been that. It's when you write, in 1984, for example, it's one thing to live through it, but writing about it or writing about that kind of violence. When I was writing The Shadow Lines, I think, the Shadow Lines really grew out of the 1984 riots because it made me try to remember the role of communal violence in my own life, in my own childhood, and so on. And it was there in Sri Lanka, it was there in Bengal. So, and in writing that book, writing the book was traumatizing, as was in an antique land. I wouldn't say that writing for me is ever therapeutic. I think writing is where you really struggle with what you see around you. You really struggle and it becomes real. So similarly, for example, writing about climate change was not at all therapeutic. It was, it created, again, a complete upheaval in my life, in my way of looking at things. So no, I wouldn't say, but again, that was one of the things that made me write The Great Derangement. And the book that I'm writing now, which is actually, I'm just sort of correcting the proofs that will be out in September. Which is, it extends and enlarges on many of the themes of The Great Derangement through Indian Oceanic history. Just looking at all that, I can't say that writing is at all therapeutic, but, for me now, it is a practice. It's what I do. I couldn't stop. And in that way, writing through this pandemic, I would say has been therapeutic in some way. It certainly kept me, it's kept me intensely busy. It's kept me working and thinking in ways that I haven't been able to do in a long time.
Actually, this is just another question, then we can, Nishat has a set of questions for you. Because I remember again a rather kind of uncanny occasion when when you visited us in Oxford, we went off to the pub, the King's Arms, for beer. And suddenly Michael Gilsonen, who was a professor of anthropology, walked in. And the two of you started speaking to each other in Arabic. So an Englishman and a Bengali meet in a pub and they start speaking in Arabic. And I think there are a lot of these encounters that happen in your novels, where in Gun Island, for example, there the character is in Venice and speaking Bengali because suddenly Venice is full of Bangladeshis. And then you go think about the island of Capri at some point, and there were all those Sri Lankan Tamil refugees speaking Tamil in an Italian space. And I think this kind of encounters that you speak about so often, which is about the polyglot nature of the world, which is also about connection. Right? It's about people connecting, despite language and also because of language. And there's something there about, writing about the world as it is. Right? I mean, this is the nature of the world. But most of our imagination seems to be monolingual. We tend to read in singular languages, right? And we lead singular lives. But there is a lot of life that's lived amidst languages, engaging with languages, and so on. So I just wanted you to reflect on, is this something that comes through your personal experience of travel, for example, that people are speaking multiple languages to each other, or is this something that is done consciously? You invent a whole language in the Ibis trilogy, right? I mean, it has traces of Hobson Jobson, it has traces of the Lascar, but it's also something that's wholly and delightfully invented. So what is the function of language in the way you write and what you write?
Well, interesting question. Let me say, first of all, that, it's interesting that you remember that incident with Michael Gilsonen. See, in a way, it's not surprising because Arabic is and always has been a global language. Right. It's a language which is an international language. It's spoken everywhere, partly because of the Islamic traditions. But Arabic is an international language. So when you meet someone and start speaking in Arabic, it's not really that surprising. Bengali, on the other hand, is spoken by as many people as speak Arabic. But Bengali is not an international language. You don't expect, as a Bengali speaker growing up, you don't expect to meet someone and start speaking to them in Bangla, in some faraway place. It just doesn't happen. It's not like that, But that is one of the most startling changes that's occurred over these last 30 years. I now hear Bangla everywhere. In Brooklyn, for example, all the people who, just walking down the street, I hear Bangla. The people who, they restore the brownstones. They're all Bengalis. Many of the people who work in shops are Bengalis. So we speak Bangla with each other, In fact, but again, when you first address another Bangla speaker in Bangla, they're always taken aback. Because Bangla is a language of intimacy, You speak it with people speak Bangla. You don't expect a stranger to speak Bangla. So it often happens in New York, I'll get into a taxi and the taxi driver is a Bengali. He takes me not to be a Bengali or something or whatever. He doesn't expect that a stranger will be able to understand what he's saying. So, they're on the phone with those Bluetooth things. And you hear them having these most incredible personal conversations, which they would never, talking about, their girlfriends or whatever. And they don't expect that you'll understand, So when I get out at the end, I always say to them, you speak very, very clear Bangla. Thank you. That was an interesting ride. And they are invariably, absolutely, it's like they've fallen out of the sky. They can't believe that you understood what they were saying, but this is something completely new. Similarly, I've been going to Italy for a very long time, but it's literally over the last 20 years that you started hearing Bangla everywhere in Italy. So I was spending some time in Venice, as you must, I'm sure you all know Ca' Foscari, which also has, many programs and so on, wonderful language programs especially. So, they invited me and I spent some time there. And that's when I really noticed that everywhere around me, everyone was speaking Bangla. But it wasn't just Bangla. They were speaking the Madaripuri dialect of Bangla, which I used to speak with my grandmother. So it was completely uncanny. I mean, I hadn't spoken that dialect in decades, but I recognized it. And, it was so moving and again, so uncanny, So, I think the book, Gun Island, really grew out of these kinds of extraordinary encounters, and I began to ask myself, what is going on? What is this enormous displacement that's actually happening? You remember that European so-called migration crisis that started in 2015. When you read about it, the sort of media discourse on it was that all these people are fleeing war-torn areas and so on, and that they're fleeing from sub-Saharan Africa. But if you looked at the newspaper pictures or at the television footage, anybody could see that, I mean, at least I could see that many of these refugees were in fact South Asians, and I could even see that they were Bengali, because Bengalis, Bengalis recognize each other just as we all do, I suppose. So I became very puzzled by this, and I thought, what is going on? Because, Bangladesh may have its problems, but it's not a war-torn area by any means, And in fact, I mean, they've overtaken India now in their GDP and so on, per capita GDP, etc. It's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. A huge success story, says Kaushik Basu, in The Economist. So I became, very intrigued by this. And I went off in 2016 to Italy, and I traveled around all these, refugee camps and the whole sort of system of reception of refugees, interviewing people, these young men, and they're overwhelmingly young men who crossed the Mediterranean in these rickety boats, And it was a really eye-opening experience for me just to see what was happening, what was underway. And it completely linked back to the 19th century, to Indian Ocean networks, to the Lascar profession. It was really eye-opening in so many ways. Because, the first Bangladeshis to come to the Veneto, the region of Venice, were actually Lascars. I mean, as for instance, happened in New Orleans, in New York, I'm sure some of you will know the book Bengali Harlem, where he takes up this question of how the Lascars settled in various places. So, and the Lascars who went to the Veneto basically went into the shipbuilding yards, near Venice, in Mestre and so on. And that's where still most of the Bengalis live. So it's a very interesting thing. I mean, this entire movement is so much rooted in history, but also in the present day, in the climate displacements, political conflicts.
Thanks, Amitav. Over to Nishat.
Thanks, Dilip. Amitav, you talked about refugees, and using that trope, I'll take you back to the question of oceanic imagination and archipelagic imagination. On the hindsight, one feels that you seem to have planned all your books even before you set out to write. I mean, the way one sees the connection between your first book and what you are writing today. You have been engaged with refugees, your engagement with refugees is not something new. Right from your first writings, you have been engaged with question of displacement, people who migrate, people who are displaced, the subaltern, the people who are on the margins of history. So, is there a link between your engagement with ocean, or does oceanic imagination help you retrieve the lives of, recuperate the lives of these people who are at the margins of history?
I suppose really that my own family history of displacement, my own history of, the history of Bengal, really, all of it feeds into this, inevitably, I mean, I think for all of us who come from those parts of India that were partitioned, these are very vivid. These are just woven into the texture of our lives. These experiences, and certainly my personal experiences of travel and so on. So yes, absolutely, I feel a tremendous interest in this, in displacement. I always have, and I feel it more and more now. One of the things that really disappoints me, in the coverage that I see globally about displaced people, is that almost all of it is written by Westerners, Westerners who don't speak the languages, of the people who are displaced often, So, for example, one of the reasons why South Asians never figured in this sort of media narrative of the European migration crisis was simply because very few of the journalists who spoke Urdu or Bangla or Tamil, or and the discourse that the refugee presents when you're speaking to them in their own language is completely different from the discourse that they present when they're speaking any kind of official language. It's absolutely different. And you see a completely different story emerges. To me, a very fascinating story, but it's a completely different story. And I think it's very important, to get into the nitty-gritty of these things. Apart from being an anthropologist, having studied anthropology, I was a journalist for a long time. So my books don't actually start as with a great plan. I didn't plan Gun Island when I went to Italy in 2016. What took me there was really, I would say, much more a sort of journalistic interest. I was just curious. I was just wondering why. What is happening here? Why are people not writing about it? And I think there are many mysteries there. I mean, I find it so strange that Indian journalists don't go off to look into this, because one of the really bizarre things is that if you go to these refugee camps, there are masses of Bengalis, Bangladeshis, basically, Hindu and Muslim Bangladeshis, and there are masses of Pakistanis. There's you won't believe this, but there's a huge refugee camp in Sicily, in a place called Caltagirone, old town with a refugee camp, which is almost entirely Pakistani. For some reason, Pakistanis from all across Europe make their way there, and because of networks, But again, when you speak to the Pakistanis, you can see so clearly the impacts of climate, because many of them were displaced by the Jhelum floods. What are the Jhelum floods? I'd never heard of the Jhelum floods. My Pakistani friends hadn't heard of the Jhelum floods, but the Jhelum flooded in 2012, displacing, masses of people. So, but the Indians, on the other hand, are very few. I not only did I not meet any Indians in these camps, the Pakistanis and Bangladeshis I spoke to also generally didn't meet Indians. And when they did, the few Indians that they remembered meeting were almost always Punjabis. So there you see already the role of networks. And historical networks, because the whole Bangladeshi movement is actually, it's facilitated and enabled by global networks that go back, to the 19th and 18th centuries. And, the whole Laskari history has a lot to do with it. Similarly, the international network, the networks of Pakistan and the Punjab were both enabled by the history of sepoys, by sepoy history, So it was the British Indian Army that created these networks, networks for Punjabis initially. And those are the networks that now facilitate movement. Most Indians, the great majority of Indians, don't actually have those international networks. But I think they will soon. And once that happens, you're going to see an even greater churn in movements. For now, the movements of displaced people in India are mainly internal. Many of you will be aware that there's been a huge demographic churn within India, so that the working class today of Goa is almost entirely from the East, mainly Bengali. You know, all along the West Coast, the working class has been replaced by Easterners. There are schools in Bangalore where the majority population of children speak Bangla, not Kannada. You know, there's a huge demographic churn going on, and you know, the authorities and even the newspapers seem to have only realized this when that horrible travel ban was imposed, you know, during the pandemic. But in fact, anyone who's been keeping their eyes open will have noticed this. And again, it was, to come back to your question, Dilip, I noticed it because of language. In the village where I have a home in Goa, a small village, quite isolated, suddenly, you know, over the last 10 years, you hear Bangla being spoken more and more by the workers. The only restaurant where in the village is run by Bengalis, you know. It's an extraordinary phenomenon.
Right. So speaking of this demographic churn that you referred to, in your works like the Gun Island or the Great Derangement, and in your various lectures, you have spoken about the dangers of capitalist economy like globalization, refugee crisis, and you have tried to draw attention to a fragile relationship between humans and Earth systems. You also raised, just now also you spoke about this habitability question. So Latour, I mean, in your book, The Great Derangement, you refer to Latour quite frequently. He says that Anthropocene is crisis of modernity. Do you concur with this position? I mean, is that the reason why you turn to pre-modern cultures and texts? Is your idea of the Anthropocene a result of your engagement with Indian ocean world? Because oceans have borne the brunt, as you have been repeatedly, pointing out. Oceans have borne the brunt of this climate change the most.
Latour, you know, in his, as he sees it, modernity is really, the crisis of modernity that he's talking about is really the crisis of the 19th and 20th centuries, you know, and perhaps the late 18th century. I think it's actually goes back much further. And it's in that sense that it's very much an oceanic phenomenon. I think that the crisis really begins in the 17th and 16th centuries. So I would say that it's a crisis that is profoundly rooted in the early modern, you know, in the early modern era. The more you look around at all the phenomena that are unfolding around us, the clearer the connections become, you know. So I think the crisis really begins ultimately not as a crisis of capitalism, because capitalism only comes into being in the 19th century. I think it's a crisis of imperialism. You know, it's a crisis that begins with the empires, you know, with the earliest European voyages. I think the lines are quite, the historical lines are quite clear, and I don't know why historians don't make this argument more forcefully, but certainly it's the argument that that interests me very much. You know, capitalism, I think this whole idea of capitalism really is a kind of, how should I say, it's a kind of evasion, you know. I don't know if any of you have ever read Priya Satya's book, Empire of Guns.
Yes,
it's a really brilliant book. You know, I think it's a path-breaking book and really should be read, and it should also be read in the context of, you know, Cedric J. Robinson's work, you know, on racial capitalism. What Priya Satya demonstrates really is that the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution is armaments. It's the manufacturing of guns. You know, the manufacturing of guns in England really creates the conditions in which, you know, industrial and technological breakthroughs take place. All the major sort of innovators of that period are actually financed by a guy called Galton, you know, who's a Quaker. He's a Quaker who's running the biggest gun-making operation in the world. The way that the English, you know, depress industrialism in India is not by cutting off the fingers of the weavers and so on. It's actually by depressing the production of weaponry, you know, by flooding the market in one way and by killing off gun making inside India. It's a really brilliant book, So, the idea that capitalism is somehow prior to imperialism, or that it somehow is logically prior to empire, I think this is a completely false notion. I mean, if you look at the 17th century, what is actually being put in place? What's being put in place is what Cedric Robinson calls racial capitalism. It's the racial structures that are put in place that enable capitalism to emerge. Even if you talk about the 19th century, how can you talk about capitalism without talking about slavery, talking about various forms of bondage under which all those raw materials are produced? The idea that capitalism is somehow a self-sustaining system that's endemic to, to Europe in some way, I think it's a completely false notion. And there's so much work now being produced that shows us this,
Right.
And, it's interesting that Cedric J. Robinson ultimately, in his, who Cedric J. Robinson thanks in his book on the Black radical tradition is Kamala Harris's mother. She was evidently very close to his circle. That astonished me when I saw it. I mean, can you imagine this little Iyer lady from Tamil Nadu going off there, getting at once involved with this incredibly radical Black circle in California? But she did. She was obviously a really remarkable woman. But Cedric J. Robinson says that the reason why why Western radicals like to talk about capitalism is because it allows them to evade all the really ugly stuff, and I think that's true.
So what you're saying is, in a way, imperialism, capitalism, and modernity, all three are linked to each other in one way or the other. So, how does fiction respond to it? Because, you mentioned in The Great Derangement also, you've talked about, other Indian writers, Bengali writers. But I'm thinking of Intezar Hussain, who rejects the label of modernist fiction. And he says that he finds Jatakas a lot more modern. And he even, claims that after reading the Jatakas, the humanism of 1936 appears sectarian to me. In the Jatakas, human beings are not a separate community. All creations are one community. So by placing human and agency under the scanner, what kind of mode of being do you envisage in your writings? Because if we are thinking of, the relationship between human and earth systems, modernity, capitalism, and imperialism, they have altered it, changed it from the way it was in pre-modern society. So do you see, a larger epistemological objective in exploring these connections between Africa, Asia, Middle East, and China, especially those which are created through oceanic exchanges? I mean, as a writer, how do you respond? As a writer from Global South, how do you respond to this?
There's like an encyclopedia of questions in there. I don't know which one to respond to first.
Well, it's not often that we get the chance to speak with you. You see, so we have to ask you these pent-up questions.
I didn't know that Intezar Sahib had said this. Where does he say this?
He says this in his essay, which is titled "Naye Afsana Nigaron Ke Naam," addressed to the.
Is it translated?
It is addressed to new story, Naya Afsana, new story. Modern stories in Urdu is also called Naya Afsana or new story. So he is addressing this to modernist short story writers, who all of them accused him of using Sanskritized language. Some of them even accused him of not writing in Urdu and writing in Hindi. So he just lambasts all of them. He says that I don't care about your kind of modernity or modernism.
That is so interesting. Please send me a translation if you can.
I have translated it. I will send you my translation.
I would be very interested to see it. I'd be very interested to see it because, these are exactly the conclusions that I've come to really in the process of writing The Great Derangement. Mm-hmm. It seems to me now that, the whole literary tradition of Western modernity is completely complicit, with this, with imperialism, with capitalism, with all of those things. I mean, they're just reflections of each other, really. Mm-hmm. And that's why modern literature has been so slow to respond, to the planetary crisis that we are in today. And I completely agree with Intezar Sahib's conclusions. After I finished writing The Great Derangement, that's when I began to think that I have to go back to pre-modern literature. So since the only other language that I have is Bangla, I started reading pre-modern works in Bangla, and it's what he says is absolutely true. If you look at the Manasa Mangal Kavyas, for example, they are so responsive to the to all the forces of the earth. Mansa Devi herself is, as it were, the voice of other beings. And she's responding to it's a very ancient story. It's a story that actually predates, Brahminical Hinduism and so on. And it's a story that actually conceptualizes the fundamental conflicts of our time so clearly. This conflict between the human urge for profit, and the needs of other beings. The story conceptualizes it with complete clarity. As do many other stories, like the Bon Bibi story is exactly the same. I don't know if any of you have read the indigenous American botanist, Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a wonderful writer, and she's written an absolutely marvelous book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And in that book, she says, indigenous traditions all over the world always talk about how do you limit what you take from the earth. And she says in English, there are no such stories. And that's really true. I mean, that's why I wanted to write Jungle Nama, because that is what it's about. It's a true forest story in that way. It's a story about how to maintain a balance between the needs of the earth and the needs of humans, And it was really really exciting to do this because, again, you begin to realize as a storyteller yourself that there is something so profoundly out of whack when young people today, they have so many stories that tell them, oh, be ambitious, you need have no limits, just do it, impossible is nothing, and so on. Where are the stories that tell them, no, you must have limits. You must learn to find some sort of contentment in life, which is not all about discontent. I mean, what is capitalism about? It's a great machine for creating discontent. You want more. Where are the stories that tell you no? And in that sense, I completely agree with what Intezar Sahib said. I mean that, these earlier stories, these pre-modern stories, are actually much more real. They're much more responsive to the earth and to the crises that people faced in those days than our contemporary literature is. You look at contemporary literature in India now, it's all written by urban people who have no awareness, of what's actually unfolding, So, I do think that as a writer, I would always have identified myself as a modernist and so on, and I would have been proud of it, and I would have thought that what modern literature does is hold the human condition up to a kind of clear-eyed examination, But I see increasingly that that's absolutely not the case. Modern literature is in many ways a form of concealment. It's a form of concealment of the crisis the world is in.
Thank you. Actually,
just this about literature. Sorry, but it's equally true of the entire humanities,
Right. Yeah, but thank you, Amitav. I mean, I think this is a fundamental point that's always forgotten. And I like the fact that you insist on looking at the idea of the modern through the idea of violence, through the idea of colonialism, and the kind of effacement of this in the ways in which we think about literature as being a space that's free of this detritus of a colonial violence, for example. And colonialism and the operation of power is central to your novels in many ways. I mean, it disrupts lives just as much as it creates new geographies. And if you think about the Glass Palace, the Burmese War, the Opium Wars, and the Ibis trilogy, there's always that, the kind of accompanying hum of violence that goes alongside the creation of the modern, the creation of the British Empire. And Dipesh Chakravarti and you, I remember, had carried on a correspondence regarding 1857, the Great Rebellion, Sepoy Mutiny, however one chooses to call it, and regarding the nature of colonialism. And what I think where you and Dipesh departed was in your pointing to the underside of the Enlightenment, the idea of the Enlightenment, as it were, saying that Western violence was central to the formation of the world. And I'd just like you to speak to that, because I thought, I mean, even at that point, when I read it as a historian, I was very conscious that it called to me in a way that Cedric Robinson's work calls to us, Eric Williams's work calls to us. And so what do these phrases that are current now about post-colonial decolonization, the decolonial, all of that mean to you when you think about the centrality of Western violence and the making of the world? So that recently there was a book on China which doesn't use the word Anthropocene, it calls it the Caucasocene, from the Caucasian people. So I think there's a whole set of ideas that you've raised there, particularly the idea of violence. And I'd like to just dwell a bit on that, speak a bit more on that if you can.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because what you absolutely are right about is that my fundamental disagreement with Dipesh on that, and it was a very respectful disagreement, because I greatly admire his work, is that he effaces, I felt in that book, racism and violence, And, and I think a lot of Indian historians don't take those things into account. And, I have a theory about it.
Please do tell.
It's because, sorry?
No, please do tell us.
The whole background of martial races and so on. And, Bengalis and South Indians were not generally accounted within those martial races. And so many historians are actually from, Bengal and South India. So, they don't have familial memories of violence, because what the British were very skilled at was concealing the violence. The soldiers were always put away in cantonments. The ordinary civilians hardly ever saw soldiers, but all around them, there was this railway network built to bring, you start any little murmuring and, a whole regiment will turn up, overnight, because the whole rail network has been constructed in that way, So I do feel that, there's a systematic, India was, and I think you must have read The Garrison State. India was a garrison state. It was a military state. It was completely a military and highly militarized state. Everything about it was military, But there's almost, how much military history is there of India? It's such a tiny segment of our historiography, Tiny, neglected, and in fact treated, even when it's treated generally as social history, rather than a history of violence as such. Right. When I was writing the Ibis trilogy, I was so shocked to discover that almost nothing has been written from a military point of view about the First Opium War, which was fought largely by Indian soldiers. There were like 4,000 British soldiers. There were 4,000 Indian soldiers, but there were like 25,000 Indian camp followers, who made the whole thing possible. And yet there was no military history of the First Opium War has been written. You would think Indian historians would be rushing to write it, but it hasn't been written. I had to literally recreate that history myself. And actually, if you consider the history of Asia, what is more important than the First Opium War?
Yeah.
There's nothing more important. It leads to the complete transformation of China. There's a direct line between the First Opium War and today. And yet we live in such denial, about it. The First Opium War is financed by Bombay merchants. It's financed by other opium merchants. It's fought by Indian soldiers. It's, even the ships most of the transport ships were crewed by Indians. I mean, the entire infrastructure is from India, and yet it's as if it never happened, So I do feel that this is a real issue in relation to historiography. I mentioned Priya Satya before, her Empire of Guns, but she's just come out with another book, which is, I think, in many ways even more brilliant. It's called The Monster of Time or something, and it's really about Time's Monster. Yeah, have you read it?
Yes, I'm actually reading it right now, coincidentally. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's completely brilliant, and it's well, I mean, for the benefit of others who haven't read it, it's really about the creation of history as a discipline, and how complicit it was. I mean, it was entirely a sort of discourse of imperialism. It was a discourse of supremacy, and that's been one very interesting thing to see in this pandemic period. Here in Brooklyn, I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement was so deeply invested in history. I mean, even on those marches, people were carrying placards which had footnotes, linking to various kinds of history. So that's the interesting thing. I mean, you remember that, until the 1960s or 70s, 90% of historical writing was about the so-called historical nations, which was all basically in the West. It was, other histories were of very limited interest. But that has really changed now. So we are seeing a sea change. We are seeing an epistemological change. And it's interesting that the pandemic has brought it about, has accelerated this whole process of, rethinking our relations with the past.
Thanks. Nishat, just a suggestion. I mean, we're coming up to 1 hour now since we started. So perhaps you could ask a question, I could ask a question, and then we could open it up to the audience. Would that be all right?
Sure. You mentioned Priya Setia, and another uncanny coincidence. We had Priya Setia's lecture at Jamia today, of course, online. So she spoke about her book this morning on online mode. So Dilip is reading Priya Setia. We had a lecture by Priya Setia, and Amitav was talking about Priya Setia. Anyway, going back to erasure of history that Amitav is talking about, I'll go back to the question of language, because as is clear from your writings, Amitav, you are deeply fascinated by the phenomenon of language, from your discussion of Judo-Arabic in an antique land to a melange of tongues that you discuss, touch upon in Abyss trilogy, and especially Laskari, which you have described as profoundly eclectic tongue. And in Gun Island, again, you turn to etymology. Etymology is another, field that seems to fascinate you. So what does it mean to write polyglot fiction? I mean, how important is the idea of Creole or Creolization in your work, which kind of tries to, as one feels, it tries to demonstrate that dialogue between people from across racial, regional, and religious identities, traveling in the Indian Ocean. And, it seems that as though, this dialogue was not simply metaphorical, but it is also, preserved in the polyglot tongues. So is language a way of reaching out to those, interconnections and linkages?
Thank you. That's very interesting. I have to say that I noticed that I'm getting a lot of messages, and I'm sorry, I can't even read them because I'm talking and or listening. So please excuse my not responding to the messages.
We'll get back to those questions later.
Yes.
Sure. I think the Indian Ocean has always been a very multilingual space. So I wanted to recreate some kind of simulacrum of that in the Ibis trilogy and in many of my other books. But how do you do that? I mean, that's the basic problem that we face, those of us who write in a monolingual form, like the novel. You can't actually have different languages in a novel. It's just not possible. So what the sort of solution to that question, this is actually a very interesting question that even Sanskrit theorists confronted, in very interesting ways. And the way that they theorized it was that you cannot actually create a multilingual text. It's not possible. But their solution was that use different registers of language. So, for example, certain kinds of characters would speak the Eastern Upper Brahmsa, while other characters were speaking Sanskrit, and other characters would speak the Western Upper Brahmsa, which were more or less, understandable, comprehensible by everyone within a text. So my solution to the problem in the Ibis trilogy was to use various registers of English, And fortunately, there are so many registers of English available within the Indian Ocean space. There's the Singaporean dialect, there's the sort of Laskari dialect, and all these other sort of registers of English. But the most interesting aspect of it for me was the discovery of the Laskari dictionaries, which didn't come about by accident. One of the really remarkable things about the whole technology of sailing is that it's very much tied to language. Because what happens on a sail ship? A captain, an officer stands on the deck and yells out an order, and everyone has to respond immediately. Because if they don't respond, we are talking about, let's say, 100 sailors have to respond immediately. So they have to understand what is being said. So language is critically enmeshed in the whole technology of sail, which is why some of the earliest dictionaries, going back to the 16th century and so on, are actually nautical dictionaries. So when I looked at crew lists of ships in the Indian Ocean and saw how multicultural they were, I said to myself, they must have had some kind of nautical language. And then I started to look, and I said, if there's such a nautical language, there must have been a dictionary. And looking, and at that time I was visiting at Harvard, so they have fantastic resources. So I actually found this Thomas Roebuck's dictionary of the Laskari language, which was completely fascinating for me, honestly, because then I began to realize that so many of these words actually come to us through Portuguese, and of course Arabic and Persian, but the Portuguese influence was particularly interesting to me because it's so much a part of the texture of Indian life. I mean, what could be more Indian than a balti? I mean, at least when I was a kid, we all grew up with baltis, bathing out of baltis, carrying baltis of water here and there. And it was astonishing to me to discover that balti is a Portuguese word. Similarly, mistri, what is more common than a mistri? Again, mistri comes from the Portuguese. So many of these words, So in fact, I mean, Bengali, standard Bengali and standard Hindi are also very, in some sense, they are also creoles.
Thanks, Amitav. I mean, we have hundreds of questions, and I'm actually getting completely distracted in this triangular conversation. There's the conversation we are having with you in the chat box. There are all kinds of questions that are being raised which engage with what we are talking about. But I suppose we'll have to now somehow steer the conversation towards an end. Otherwise, we'll keep you here forever. And it's been 30 years or more since we've actually had a conversation. So that's another another lack in my life. But I'd just like to end with a last question, and a last question only in the sense that it's the final question. It's not a question that actually brings to a close the conversation. I'd like to admit that Calcutta Chromosome is one of my favorite novels. I mean, I loved it. I've read it only 4 or 5 times. It also takes me back to my childhood and the kind of mystery detective novels that I read and so on. I mean, it's in the nature of a detective thriller, it's science fiction, and of course it spans the geography of empires. It keeps colonialism center stage, to go back to some of the things that we've talked about. In The Great Derangement, you speak about how we stand in water up to our necks, yet our imagination is unable to grasp or grapple with the fact of species annihilation and global warming, even in science fiction, right? I mean, it's almost as if science fiction, which allows us to let our imagination roam free, exchange engage with the exigencies of the future, somehow there's a kind of lack. And you kind of try to explain this by talking about the connections between Western capitalism and the kind of environmental degradation, where the complicity of capitalism with the environmental degradation and a kind of hesitancy, a kind of effacement, which doesn't allow the engagement with the idea of how central Western imperialism has been to the crisis that we are facing right now. One of the two questions, that was just a summary of things that you've said, but two things. One is that Gun Island brings in it together the idea of the supernatural. Now, this is there in Calcutta Chromosome as well. There's something in excess of the rational, right? The idea of the supernatural, where the protagonist is in the plane, he sees the snakes in the air, as it were. So there is the addressing of another dimension to the dimension of the rational dimension that we occupy, which is a kind of a specter that haunts your novels. And I think this is very interesting. It comes up again in Hungry Tides. It may come up again in your recent novel, which is set in the Sundarbans, right? I mean, where the idea of the supernatural is always there, which we don't speak to, we don't address, but it's always there. That's one thing. The second thing is that, I think one of the interesting things that you've been saying is that, we constantly talk about the idea of the Anthropocene right now, and it's a very complicated notion that hides many histories. But also, I think Anthropocene is probably a way of restoring the narcissism, where we put ourselves, humans, again back in the picture, where once we created, now we destroy. Right? But we are at the center of the picture. And I think there's a way in which your work actually decenters the human. Right? When you think about Hungry Tides, and I look forward to the recent novel, so both the idea of the supernatural as well as the larger space, which Nishat spoke about in terms of Intizar Hussein's invocation of how all creatures are part of the space that we live in. So maybe you could speak to some of that?
Absolutely, absolutely. See, let me say, first of all, that Anthropocene is not a word that I actually use very often. And there are all kinds of critiques of it, and I think well-justified critiques. I think this Caucasus Ocene is a good competitor word. I would say Eurocene, but you can use that if you like, and there are so many others. But at the same time, Anthropocene, it's a useful concept in the sense that it, if it's restricted to geology, I think then it could be a useful concept. But I don't think otherwise it's a particularly useful idea or concept. Yes, see, you really put your finger on it, which is really that I would say the real problem is the human and the non-human, which comes completely out of a kind of the European Enlightenment imaginary, this whole idea of the human and the non-human. Also the human, the social and the natural, or the historical and the natural, you could say. All of this comes out of this moment of Enlightenment thought. But we have to remember that preceding this moment in Enlightenment thought is actually the conquest of the Americas, which is the bloodiest thing that has ever happened in human history. I mean, it's actually inconceivable, the violence of it. I mean, 95% reductions of population, in the Americas. I mean, a reduction of population so great that it probably had an impact on the atmosphere, on the global climate. So it's staggering if you think of the violence of the conquest of the Americas. There's never been anything like it. People talk about Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan never came even remotely close to. The other day, President Barack Obama was saying, "Oh, at least he has this whole narrative of progress." So he was saying, "Oh, look at the time of Genghis Khan and so on." I think Genghis Khan. You're thinking of Genghis Khan sitting in America where 95% of the population was killed off. What sort of fantasy is that? But, so yeah, I mean, so when the idea of these separations between the human and the non-human and the natural and the historical and all of this, is enacted out of the sort of background of these conquests, and fundamentally these ideas are ideologies of conquest, because you look at this the human non-human thing. Even after Linnaeus comes up with the idea of the Homo sapiens, he immediately qualifies it and says there are various kinds of Homo sapiens. So even when they're saying the human and the non-human, they're not including all humans. It's only some humans. Most humans are actually non-human in their eyes. That's why they can be killed. I mean, they called this. You remember the conference of Valladolid? In the 16th century, they couldn't decide whether Amerindians were human. They couldn't come to any conclusion on that. And this is actually the fundamental dilemma that it plants at the heart of European of Enlightenment culture, of Western culture. They're talking about the human, but in fact, they regard the great majority of human beings as non-human, as brutes. That's when this word emerges, the brute, And, what makes a brute? A brute cannot make meaning. Famously in The Tempest, that is what happens. The Caliban has the faculty of speech, but he cannot make meaning until Prospero intervenes, So this is the extraordinary thing. If you try to think your way out of this whole human, non-human thing, what are you left with? You're left with a spectrum of beings, which is actually how historically most humans have thought about the earth, as a whole spectrum of beings. Beings who make meaning, who communicate. We know now that trees communicate in very, very complex ways. We know that they're incredibly complex ways of communication amongst non-humans. But again, the instant that you open up this question of the non-human, there are other things on the spectrum. There are other presences on the spectrum. You call them supernatural. I would not call them supernatural. I would just say the spectrum of the non-human is vast, and you can't limit it. And that's really the problem that you enter, That's really the question that you come to. As soon as you start contending with the non-human in any serious way, how do you limit the spectrum of the non-human? You simply cannot, So, yes. And, I think we talk a lot about a European, British colonial literature, which actually, to my mind, is not particularly interesting. I think Dutch colonial literature is actually much more interesting, especially Dutch writing about Indonesia. I don't know if any of you know the work of Louis Couperus. He wrote a book called The Hidden Force, which I think is perhaps the most important colonial novel written, in the 19th century. And it's all about, this whole idea of the non-human and where the non-human comes. There's also another writer called Maria Dermoot, who also writes in a very powerful way about the presence of non-humans, the whole spectrum of the non-human. So, yes, that is the fundamental thing. And that's why I think the humanities really profoundly founder, when they come to this question of how do you deal, And that's why, history as a discipline is, I think, in for a sort of very profound reckoning, with its fundamental assumptions, because history is so anthropocentric. History as a discipline cannot contend with the non-human, because the non-human doesn't produce written records, And this is exactly the dilemma that Intezar Said was pointing to, and that I'll point to, As soon as you take the non-human seriously, the idea of history as a documentary record completely crumbles, because you have to allow for voices which do not produce records, but which are agential, You take the way that history approaches the things of the world. Most of all, let's say, things that are produced by trees or by plants. You know, we see so many agential aspects to trees and forests. Anat Singh shows in a brilliant book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, how forests actually do possess historical agency. You know, in the same way, there's a whole spectrum of other things that possess agency of various kinds. You know, and I think this is clearest in relation to an extreme case, which is opium. You know, if you think of opium, the Dutch start trading it on a mass scale in the 16th century, you know, across the eastern Indian Ocean and so on. And then the British build upon that and, you know, build a huge empire on that, you know, which sustains them. But while the British while Europeans are trading in this thing, which is a completely modern trade, by the way, and they make up this whole myth about the Mughals having opium monopoly, which has now been completely exploded, you know. But it's a completely modern trade. The mass trade in opium is completely modern, you know. But they present it as ancient, as medieval, as a sort of remnant of earlier times. So the idea there is that, you know, degenerate races and so on, and, you know, dying races, which was a thing they were very obsessed with, that, you know, they take to opium because they're degenerate, because they're declining, and because it's rooted in their history. So the idea is that they themselves are enmeshed with a narrative of progress where they leave things like opium, etc., behind. But you see, that never happened. Opium didn't disappear. It wasn't like indigo. It wasn't like Gambia. It didn't disappear. It has this agential ability to reinsert itself into history, as it has done in America, you know, most ironically, you know, because so many Americans were opium traders. So you see the agential property that some of these things have. And, you know, in older forms of storytelling, storytellers contended with this. Right. You know, you look at Greek stories. You even look at within the Mahabharata, you know, the powers that are accorded to botanical substances. You know,
the entire Dastan tradition, for that matter.
Exactly. There you are. Absolutely. History and you know, modern fiction has no way of according agency, you know, to these things, and yet we know that agency exists. Mm-hmm. How do we incorporate it into our world? And these are the challenges that we are faced with, you know, just in narrating the world to our children, you know. Right. So again, Intizar Sahib is absolutely right. I think that our ancestors were able to do this much more effectively than we are.
And if you remember, you remember in the Mahabharata, the burning of the Khandava forest, which is the inauguration of the build, is told through the story of the Croncha birds, which are actually at the heart of the fire, who are concerned about the bird that's concerned about its children. So I think your conversation has had the most extraordinary range, and I thank you for being with us. And the chat box has actually reflected some of this excitement that the themes that you've raised have occasioned in the minds of many of the comments here. But we have to kind of wind this up right now in terms of our engagement with you and open it up to questions. So I'll hand over to Nishat and then Stephen. But thank you so much for this conversation. It was like reading one of your books. You know, the ideascape was tremendously large. Thank you. Over to Nishat.
Thank you, Dilip. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you for having me.
Dilip. Now I will pass it on to Stephen to take up questions from the chat.
Yes, ma'am. So I have collected and combined few questions together. Otherwise, there are a lot of questions to answer. I don't think we'll be able to finish it on time. So I'll start with one of the questions on Calcutta chromosome. So there are two questions in this. So one is they're asking for a comment on Calcutta chromosome, the science fiction genre, and the moment of climate change in it, and what was the political and social context to it. And secondly, what was your inspiration to write the Calcutta chromosome?
Well, you know, in as much as our contemporary storytelling traditions contend with the non-human, it's science fiction that does it, you know, science fiction, fantasy, etc. So I've always been very interested in science fiction, and I was delighted that the Calcutta Chromosome won the Arthur C. Clarke Award. So, you know, when I long ago in my 20s, when I was in Calcutta, I would stand next to the hospital. I used to wait for buses near a memorial for Ronald Ross and his discovery of the malaria parasite, and that really sparked it off. And you know, and the Calcutta Chromosome is very much about the entire spectrum of non-humans. You know, including the internet, which is today perhaps the most agential force in the world around us.
So moving to the next question, something related to non-human world. So first of all, what inspired you to write The Hungry Tide? Would you see Gun Island as a sequel to The Hungry Tide to carry forward the dialectic of excessive human interference with the non-human world, but how to resolve this tension without drifting into a romantic climax?
The Hungry Tide, you know, I've had a long connection with the Sundarban, going back to my childhood, because one of my uncles actually lived and worked there. So I always wanted to write about the Sundarban, and it always puzzled me that so little was actually written about the Sundarban. You know, the Sundarban is a strange absence, even in Bangla literature, I would say. You know, considering its enormous importance within the sort of ecology and geography of Bengal. So I did want to write about it. And, you know, there again, you know, landscapes have agency. They have a way of inserting themselves into your brain, which is why, you know, so many indigenous traditions actually are about the agency of land, the agency of, you know, natural features. And I think this is what really happened to me with the Sundarban, that it really entered my head in some strange way, you know. So when I started writing Gun Island, I didn't initially think about that it would begin in the Sundarban, but surely enough, I was led back there, and I was led back to my old characters. So I don't know if I would at all call it a sequel, because it's not really. But it was exciting in a way to revisit those characters and to see where they ended up in their lives. Because of course, you know, once you finish writing a book, the characters don't go away. They continue to have a life in your head.
Why did you grant permission to make web series on Ibis trilogy while you have been hesitant about cinematic adaptation on your novels?
I haven't been hesitant. I mean, the Hungry Tide was under contract, it was optioned by various filmmakers at various points. As for the Ibis trilogy, you know, I think all narratives should exist in multiple iterations, you know. So I'm not hesitant about that at all. If a filmmaker comes to me and provides a persuasive kind of approach, then I've always been happy to go along with it. And Shekhar Kapoor is, you know, a very fine filmmaker. So.
Sir, I'm taking 3 questions together, and
Yeah.
You have addressed them in your conversation, but maybe you can address them in a different manner this time. So the 3 questions are: why do you think that modern literature failed to express or address problems of modern age? Second, why do you think Western radicals blame climate change on capitalism? Third, can't we say that countries are free from colonization, but history is still colonial?
Good questions. Well, you know, Western radicals aren't wrong to say that capitalism is responsible for climate change. Obviously, to a great degree, it is. You know, I'm just saying that, you know, I think that the idea that colonialism is has some sort of, that capitalism has some sort of logical priority over imperialism. That is what I don't find persuasive. I think imperialism and capitalism are both subsets of each other, but I think capitalism is in some sense a subset of imperialism. So I don't think they're completely wrong, but I think we have to address the idea of power in the world and the way that power operates in the world to understand the planetary crisis as such. I'm getting feedback from someone's mic, I think.
Yes, please
So,
put everybody mute themselves. Thank you.
So, I don't think they're entirely wrong by any means. So it's precisely because of that that you are right. Whoever asked this question about colonialism and so on is absolutely right. Colonialism, the workings of empire have never disappeared. They're still with us to this day. They provide the sort of broader frame of the world. But also colonial processes are also unfolding within countries now. If you look at this neoliberalism, what happened in the last 30 years, it's really the globalization of a certain pattern of colonialism, a certain pattern of extractive colonialism, which consists often of taking land away from indigenous peoples. We see this entirely playing out now in India, in the forest areas. We see this playing out in Indonesia. We see it playing out in China in relation to the Uyghurs. I mean, basically, what's happening is the patterns of settler colonialism have been globalized. That's what it is.
Okay. The next question is, do you agree with Michel Rolf Trullo that history is silenced due to power and its production is always dominated by the Orientals or those who suppress the vulnerable? Can history be free of power now that the production of works in English literature is validating the events of history, even if it's in fragments? What do you recommend for the new writers to keep in mind before planning to write historical works?
Two completely different questions. I don't know that I can answer both really. To historical novelists, I would say the thing you have to keep in mind is that a historical novel isn't really different from any other kind of novel, in the sense that a historical novel is also driven by characters. It's driven by a story. No one is going to read a historical novel in order to read history. So you always have to be careful not to let the research overwhelm the story, as it were, and that happens quite a lot. I would say. The second thing, the second question, history and power. No, I don't think it's possible really to divorce history from power. But to some degree, that is happening right now. The counter narratives that are being produced are actually really remarkable. The 1619 project here in the US, that's been a really remarkable thing. I mean, sort of laying bare the whole context of slavery and race within the formation of America. I mean, it's a really extraordinary thing to see it out in the public. Many of us have known about these things from our reading, but to see it in the public arena like this is something that honestly I didn't expect. I'll tell you one story about the whole sort of revelations of history that come up. One day there was a Black Lives Matter protest going past my house. And, I ran out and joined it. And we ended up, and it was mainly white people, young white people. And we ended up, my house is in a part of Brooklyn called Fort Greene. And there's a park nearby called the Fort Greene Park. And we ended up there near a monument. It's a huge monument. It's called the Martyrs Memorial. And it was so interesting. I've often been there, but I found a little plaque and I started reading it. This Martyrs Monument was built, I think it was in 1756. It refers to events that happened, I think, in about 1776. Sorry, yeah, something like that. And it was an incident in which the British, after taking this part of New York, put tens of thousands of Americans onto ships, And on these ships, they died of overcrowding, malnutrition, asphyxiation. More than 11,000 Americans died, And it was so startling to see that, because I thought to myself, I bet not even 1 in 100 Americans has heard of the martyrs monument, or of what happened here. Certainly, I bet not 1 in 100 English people have heard of what they did, here in that day. But if you go to England and ask anyone, what was the black hole of Calcutta? They'll know that, And in the black hole of Calcutta, which has been completely debunked, by the way, some 40 or 50 people died, and that happened just 20 years before this Martyrs Monument. So you just think about it, the way that history is freighted, the way that it's weighted, has entirely to do with the workings of power. For the British Empire, the black hole of Calcutta was a useful myth. So they memorialized it. Partha Chatterjee has written a wonderful book about this. They memorialized it. They put up monuments to it. So, one of the remarkable things that's happened in this last year, I think, was the Rhodes Must Fall movement, the overthrowing of the statues in England. I think it marks a moment where England is finally sort of beginning to catch a glimpse of the reality of its imperial history.
So the next question is, the Oceanic literature almost begins with the Western narratives itself in form of Greek epics like Iliad and Odyssey. Then the rise of novel is again associated with this Oceanic literature, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Then we have many nautical fictions which are inclined towards the technicality of the term. Where, when, and in which work would you pinpoint this beginning of Oceanic/sea literature in Indian context, especially in the Indian writings in English?
Indian writing in English, well, look, pre-modern Bangla literature certainly is also oceanic in so many ways. I mean, the Chand Saudagar stories are about, yes, I just noticed someone, the mythologization of the Amboina massacre. That's another excellent book, really. And it shows how the English created this complete myth of Amboina and weaponized it, so these are basically myths of English victimhood. And it's such an extraordinary thing. The Black Hole massacre, the Amboina massacre, these people are conquering places where they're killing off, who knows how many people. At the same time, they see themselves as victims, And that's another thing that's come to the surface, again, suddenly in this profoundly disturbing way. I mean, the white radicals in America today, the white supremacists, they see themselves as victims, So, this is really a myth. These are myths of the Anglosphere that have come back to haunt the Anglosphere in the present today, Again, these are myths that have not been put to rest. They're lurking in a subterranean way within the culture, in a very deeply disturbing way.
Sir,
sorry, what was the second question?
Yeah, actually, there are a few more questions and comments which maybe you can read in the chat box. Now we have to conclude and end the session as well. So there's this there's not a question, but someone wants you to address the younger generation of India, because they are the future of India, they say. So someone has written that you can you address them, the younger generation and the young writers of India.
Oh my God.
Your role as Chacha Amitav to follow on the footsteps of Chacha Nehru.
Well, I would say,
You should read Amitav's writings. Simple. Yes.
Thank you, Nishat. You answered that much better.
All right. All the questions are now almost dealt with. I mean, there are a few questions which are left. Maybe you can read it towards the end and maybe answer them. Over to you, Nishat, ma'am.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Amitav Ghosh, for this very fascinating conversation in which we touched upon, a wide array of questions which are pertinent to our lives, and your very refreshing responses. I personally see so many resonances between Intezar Sahab's writings and the position that you seem to be moving, towards. I found Bon Bibi folk absolutely fascinating in The Hungry Tide, and I look forward to Jungle Nama, in which I'm told that it's going to be a verse adaptation of Bon Bibi. I'm not sure. So I really look forward to that. Before I offer a vote of thanks formally to the participants, on another note, I hope we all know that you maintain diaries and journals very meticulously. So I hope that after today's conversation, we will also find a place in your journal and will be rescued from the anonymity of history. So I thank all the participants for taking out time and being with us from different parts of the world. I know so many friends have joined from France, from Budapest, from England, from America, from Africa, and so many others from India. So thanks to all of you for joining us and for asking those very interesting questions and making this conversation so lively. Finally, I would like to thank my university, Jamia Millia Islamia, the administration of the university, which facilitates this, and most importantly, Stephen and Grace, who have worked behind the scene to make this, this program and everything that we do. They are the force behind it. So thank you, everyone, and thanks to Dilip, my partner, so to say.
Well, if I may say, thank you, Dilip. Thank you, Nishat, for organizing this. And thank you, Stephen. And yes, my book, Jungle Nama, is actually an adaptation of of an episode from the Bon Bibi legend in Poyar, that is a Bengali meter.
Okay.
And I see that my Italian translator, Anna Nadotti, is here, and she's been translating it into Italian.
Wow.
Incredibly beautiful. So, the Poyar meter is now becoming global. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this occasion, and thank you very much for having me.